Imagine the map of America with a hole torn out of the Arctic. And imagine that tear was drafted in quiet rooms while the world was still counting the dead from the last war. In the spring of 1946, inside the United States government, serious people weighed a trade that sounds like fiction today. Cede a vast wedge of northern Alaska in exchange for strategic footholds on another icebound landmass half a world away. No battlefield decided it, no vote in a small town hall. It rose from briefings and budgets, from fear dressed as foresight. The president sitting at the desk when those papers moved was Harry S. Truman, the Missourian who stepped from vice presidency into the Oval Office in April of 1945 after Franklin Roosevelt died, inheriting a global empire and a nuclear age in the same breath. He was not a man who needed Alaska to feel big, yet the presidency does not let you ignore what lands on your desk when generals and diplomats start drawing futures in pencil. This is not a story about a cartoon villain selling states for pocket change. It is a story about strategy, desperation, pride, and how close a line can come to being crossed before it snaps back into place. And if you stay with it, you will see why the idea collapsed and why the near miss still matters. To understand the shock of 1946, you have to feel how Alaska had already lived a double life in the imagination. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward negotiated the purchase from Russia, and President Andrew Johnson signed the treaty into law. Critics mocked it as a frozen warehouse, a punchline, a folly. Then time did what time does. The check cleared. The flag went up. The formal transfer ceremony at Sitka in October of 1867 turned a transaction into a ritual. Alaska became American soil in more than name, even when Washington still treated the territory like a distant attic, useful when needed and easy to forget when not. The irony runs deeper than 1 century. Seward's own expansionist imagination had once roamed beyond Alaska toward Danish possessions, part of a 19th century habit of thinking in purchases and swaps, when the world still treated continents like ledger lines. Fast forward past gold rushes and naval worries, past Warren Harding in 1923 setting aside federal petroleum reserves in the far north because even then the Arctic was not empty on a strategist's map. By the early 1940s, the world had narrowed to oceans, air routes, and bases. Greenland was not a curiosity. It was a bridge of weather and distance, a place where storms were read like warnings and runways could mean survival. And then something unexpected happened. In April of 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Denmark, and Greenland's fate became a question mark in a world on fire. In 1941, with Denmark under Nazi occupation, the United States and Denmark signed an agreement relating to the defense of Greenland. American forces could build and operate installations for the war effort, while Washington reiterated respect for Danish sovereignty over Greenland. The island became a chess piece and a runway, a meteorological station, and a statement. What came next was even more significant. When the fighting stopped, the fighting did not stop inside the maps. Public voices joined the drumbeat. In November of 1945, Senator Owen Brewster of Maine argued in Collier's that American ownership of Greenland was a military necessity, plain language for a nervous age. The Joint Chiefs of Staff looked at Greenland and saw a requirement that would not politely wait for peacetime manners. In April of 1946, State Department official John Hickerson reported that practically every member at a planning meeting said the real objective regarding Greenland should be acquisition by purchase from Denmark. The appetite was blunt. The language was calm. That calm should make your skin prickle, because calm is how enormous ideas slip past public attention. But that was not the real turning point. The turning point arrived in paperwork. In May of 1946, the State Department produced a study titled Proposals with Respect to Greenland. It read like a polite brief and thought like a general staff. It weighed purchase, partial purchase, and alternatives. The paper itself contained a little civil war. The Joint Chiefs' preferred solution seemed to be purchase, yet the report noted the Secretary of State had not been formally advised of that view by the Joint Chiefs themselves, a sentence that reads like a raised eyebrow preserved in carbon copy. Then it named Alaska again, not as a rumor, but as a formal option. The document considered Danish reluctance to sell Greenland for money alone, because money cannot always heal a wound to national pride, and because Denmark was described as a weak state still carrying the weight of occupation and loss. A phrase that can chill you when you remember how casually power writes about other nations. So American planners floated a territory for territory trade. In exchange for zones of military value, the United States might cede an equivalent amount of land in the Point Barrow district of Alaska. The language in the report is precise in a way that still stings. It speaks of juicy swaths of oil-rich stretches of the North Slope, of permitting Denmark to develop mineral resources found there, including petroleum, with the proviso that oil produced be sold to the United States. Read that twice. The government was not pretending Alaska's north was worthless. Naval exploration had already pushed into the region during the war. The report even acknowledges awareness of petroleum potential. At the time, no one could forecast Prudhoe Bay in 1967. Yet the irony is almost cinematic. The document that toyed with trading away part of the North Slope appeared in the same decade that would later prove how much treasure could sleep under ice when the right technology finally arrived. And then something unexpected happened inside the bureaucracy itself. The same report discarded the Alaska swap as a practical path. The difficulties of negotiating such an agreement could rival the difficulties of buying the island outright, while American military interests might still be better served by owning Greenland entirely. The idea surged onto the table, then collapsed under its own weight. Alaska remained intact, at least on paper, because the swap was deemed a non-starter. Picture the map departments in Washington, the files crossing desks, the way a typewriter can turn a coastline into a commodity. The Point Barrow district was not empty space waiting for a label. It was home to communities whose lives did not appear in the arithmetic of equivalent acreage. That silence does not belong to 1946 alone. It belongs to a longer pattern in which Arctic policy was debated as if the land were mostly weather and distance. When the Senate ratified the Alaska Purchase Treaty in April of 1867, the vote was lopsided, yet public ridicule still clung to the deal for years, proof that political approval and popular belief do not always arrive together. The same skepticism could have returned in a different costume if a trade had ever gone public, if newspapers had ever printed a headline about swapping Alaska's north for Denmark's ice. Secrecy was not a detail. It was the container, and the silence traveled for decades. Yet the story does not end with a discarded paragraph. But that was not the end of the pressure either. What happened next changed everything in diplomatic terms, because the United States pivoted from trade fantasies to a cash offer with Cold War urgency. On December 14, 1946, Secretary of State James Burns met Danish Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen and put forward a proposal that belonged to the age of empires and gold. The offer was on the order of $100 million in gold for Greenland, a sum framed against older purchases and present fears, including the memory of $25 million paid for the Danish West Indies decades earlier. Burns later recalled that American needs seemed to come as a shock, that Rasmussen did not reject the suggestions flatly at first, that he promised to study a memorandum. Given time to breathe, Danish pride returned like a tide. Rasmussen called the proposal absurd. He told the American ambassador that while Denmark owed much to the United States, it did not owe America the whole island of Greenland. Opposition in Denmark crossed political lines. The purchase did not happen. Sovereignty held. Negotiations shifted toward continued military partnership instead of sale, leading toward a new Defense of Greenland Pact signed in 1951 that expanded the American military footprint while Danish sovereignty remained the bedrock the diplomats kept signing back onto. Years later, a State Department officer would warn in a memorandum that overt purchase talk could damage the very access the United States already enjoyed. A quiet verdict on how dangerous the old fantasy could be when reality had moved on. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, like the video and subscribe for more weekly breakdowns, because stories like this only survive when someone bothers to read the memos the world forgot. Here is the human cost beneath the policy. Indigenous communities in northern Alaska were not consulted when distant officials sketched trades on paper. The report even claimed no criticism had been leveled at American treatment of Alaska natives, a sentence that reads less like reassurance and more like a blind spot carved into the record. The emotional contrast is stark.
On one side, strategy rooms measuring ice in miles and minutes of flying time. On another side, people whose homelands were treated as interchangeable blocks on a map. The Truman years were a hinge. Europe lay in rubble. The Soviet Union loomed. America was learning how to be a superpower without always knowing which bargains would age into wisdom and which would age into embarrassment. Truman himself would become the face Americans attached to that era, the man who ordered atomic use and containment thinking, the man who carried a plain-spoken style into decisions that were anything but plain. Yet the Alaska swap was not a story of one midnight signature. It was a story of systems, of incentives, of what gets considered when a nation believes its security is negotiable only in territory and bases. The Alaska for Greenland idea never became law, never became treaty, never became headline in the way a war becomes headline. It remained a near miss, a path not taken, a warning etched in bureaucratic prose, and that is why it still grips you. History is not only what happened, it is also what almost happened. The quiet moment when a nation's pencil hovered over a line it did not cross. The map stayed the same. The lesson did not. The pen stayed dry and the 50 stars remained on the flag. History repeats itself as a farce. But luckily, common sense intervened before the great land became the greatest garage sale in history. Alaska stays for now.